So today the course was all about disability interactions and innovations. Hello. and today I'm going to try and focus on that innovation bit. So that bit where you're trying to test the things that you've invented in your labs. So you've done something, you've created a new technology, and then you're trying to move out into the world. And so at GDI Hub, we've got these 5 domains. So we do research, so things like Tecilia, our PhD projects. We do research for others. We do a lot of research. And then we do innovation. So sometimes our research projects translate into the innovation spaces, and sometimes they don't. Then we run programs. We also do teaching, and we do advocacy. And so the innovation bit of GDI Hub is called GDI Accelerate, because we like to think that we take these products or services or just policy ideas, and then we try to accelerate them into the marketplace. So the idea is to try and get things over the valley of death. So everyone heard of the valley of death? No? Okay, a couple of shakes of the head. So the valley of death is a lovely place. It's where your lovely ideas die. So you have a great idea. Let's say it's some nanotech for hearing, or it's a new type of screen reader. And you do loads of user testing, you do loads of user studies, you develop the technology, you publish lots of papers, you might win an award. And that's all still in that exploration, design, development. You get to the point where you have a prototype and it's good. And you might graduate with your PhD or, and yeah, it's good work. It's really good work. You've advanced science or engineering. Well done. But then you've got to start validating it. So you might have to start getting things like CE marking, and these might be component parts, which you might have done in your PhD. But then you've got to start validating the business side of it. Like, who's actually going to buy this? Who's actually going to distribute it for you? How are you going to sell it? How are you going to manufacture it at scale? Like, you've made it in a lab, but now you might need to make 100. Like, you made the startup made 100 units of wheelchairs the other day, the Neobolts. Like, over how many days did it take them? 3 days? 5 days to make 100 wheelchairs. Now, I'm sure when that was just a PhD project, the thought of making 100 wheelchairs. Yeah, the first one took 3 months, right? So the first wheelchair took 3 months, and now they're able to make 100 wheelchairs and ship them in 5 days, right? So how do you go from that to that? That all takes validation. You're going to have to validate who's your customer. You're going to have to validate how you're going to produce it. You're going to have to validate. So even though you made it, and it's all nicely CE marked and everything else, you've now got to get a manufacturing process in place, and that process has to be validated. So there's loads and loads of validation. And in all of that steps, things begin to fail, mainly because you run out of money, or you run out of time, or you realize it's not scalable for whatever reason, right? If you begin to get to the point where you are scaling, which is probably just at the point where Neobolt are, you're then going into a growth phase. So you're now going from that's probably their biggest order. So previously they might have done 10, and now they're beginning to do 100. And now they'll have to get to the point, if they get very successful, of how do we do 100 or 1,000 each week? Does that make sense? Well, how do we begin to do that? And that changes lots of things, because then you've got to hire people. So when you're doing maybe one-off 100, you might just get some new staff in just for that batch. But if you're employing people for a number of years, as we found in GDI Hub. So GDI Hub in some ways is a startup. We had this idea. It is now a not-for-profit company, Section 8 or whatever it is here, company. And we went through this growth phase. Like, all of a sudden we had to start hiring people. Then we had to figure out, how do we hire people in different countries? Like, what are the tax regulations in different countries? How do we have a HR? We suddenly realized we need a maternity policy, or, you need a policy on, like, what happens if somebody's sick or they've got caring responsibilities. Like, all of these things, as you grow as a company, you suddenly need much more robust processes than it was when it was just you and your 2 friends with an idea. So all of these things have to come in place. And so in that bit is called, in the whole of the innovation world, it's called the valley of death. And it means that in this valley, a lot of ideas die. So venture capitalists, for example, the really extreme venture capitalists, will invest in 100 ventures knowing that 99 will fail, and they don't care. They're looking for the one that's going to make $1 billion. And so if you're one of these 100 ventures getting venture capital from some fund, and I met somebody the other day at the Royal Academy of Engineering, and he had come out of Oxford University. They had a startup. It was an AI-based startup. It wasn't in assistive technology. He said they got to this growth stage. They were doing really well, and then they took venture they took capital from this venture capital company that he said he's never been treated so badly in his life. He's never been worked so hard. He's never been like absolutely crushed to the point where the company folded, even though they had sales of over £1 million. Right? It wasn't like they were not investable in. The company folded. Him and two of the other people who were part of the startup had breakdowns, and he's now back because he's a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. He's a very established engineer. He's now back doing work as he was mentoring another company that I was mentoring, and he was saying, I'm now back trying to make sure that these companies don't get sucked in the way we were sucked in. I just want to help all of these ventures not be crushed, because these people with lots and lots of money, they don't care that 99 of you have had breakdowns. They just care that they've made this money. So in all of that pressure cooker, you're trying to get your little venture to market. So it's really hard. And in assistive technology, it's been proven that the valley of death is both deeper and wider. So by that I mean all of those problems that we had at the beginning where people didn't know what assistive technology was. So when you go to pitch your idea, for example, you end up with people not really understanding that hearing loss is such a problem. Whereas, for example, if you were selling something that was going to stabilize crops, people would go, oh yes, climate change. I know there's climate change. Yes, I know that India needs more stable crops. Yes, your AI thing works very well. Thank you. And there's an entire sector on, say, finance tech or agri-tech or... So now at the moment, you're beginning to get this like feminist tech, venture capitalist stuff that's all about tech for women and backing female ventures. And there's beginning to be growth in this disability space, but it's not as established as these other spaces. So it's much harder to get the money. And the problems you're trying to tackle have more diversity in them. So you need more and more evidence. So it's just genuinely really difficult. So what we do at GDI Hub is we have these innovation components within GDI Accelerate. We still do some research. So we're always doing research for ventures, just trying to help them get more evidence. We create tools, which I'll show you in a second, and then we produce what we call solutions. And these solutions are not products. They're the programs that will help accelerate a venture. So they might be an accelerator, there might be an impact fund, but we'll have these programs for innovators where they can come in, join one of our programs, and then they leave. So the idea is that these sort of work together. We work in a little triangle. And that a program would come in, a venture would come into a program, and they would need some research, so the research people would help. They might make use of some of our tools, so they would take some of the tools, but it would all be delivered in one program. So as far as they're concerned, that's the program. So when we're designing a new program, we think we've got all of these tools, we've got all these research ideas, which bits are needed for this particular set of ventures that we're going to support. So here's some ones that we've supported before, for example. So examples of tools, I showed you the innovators map yesterday. That's a type of a tool, like it's good, and that's to help grow the overall ecosystem. So when you go to speak to ministers, you say, look, there's a growing ecosystem. Here's one A4 page showing you all of the ventures. And then they begin to realize, oh, this is a thing. It's not just this one person. The other sort of tools we can create are accelerators and scaling vehicles. So the other thing would be a toolkit. So we've created this toolkit, which is on the GDI Hub website. So if you're looking for methods, some of you were talking about methods before. For example, if you want to know about public funds and grants, you can click on it and it will tell you what it is and how difficult it is to maybe get that money. Whereas, for example, what does open source mean? What does a patent mean? What does an elevator pitch mean? So we just started creating these little cards. Each time a venture asked us a question, like, I don't understand what a patent is, we'd make a card. And then so that the answer would be there for everybody. So if anybody asks us a question, we try to add to the toolkit. Yeah, you saw the map before. So one example of this is in the early stage, so in about this part here, where you're going from here to here, this is where you need a bit of data. It's normally like a clinical trial. And so one example was the example of Amparo that I mentioned briefly before. So these are examples of photographs that I've taken in various prosthetics and orthotics workshops around the world when I've just been traveling. But I've never gone into a P&O workshop, if I was in Uganda or going to Kenya. In the private hospitals, it's different. But in any public hospital, there's always a machine that's not working, always. It's quite impressive. Like there's always like the vacuum pump's not working, and why can't they get the vacuum pump to work? Well, they're waiting for a spare part, and spare part's coming from Germany, and it's stuck in customs. And, so every time there's some sort of hacked solution. But even when everything works, Making a socket is a lengthy process, and it takes several hours. So you would normally travel, and in India, you might be traveling several, or tens, or even 100 kilometers, probably tens of kilometers in India, to a clinic. And then the cast would happen, and then they wouldn't be able to fit it that day. You'd have to come back, right? So it can take several visits over several weeks for you to get your limb. And the workshops themselves, the equipment doesn't work, but also the equipment is very expensive. So Amparo was a startup that came to us, that came out of a student project, a master's project, where they had realized that they wanted to change the service delivery model. So what if the clinic came to the patient rather than the patient comes to the clinic? And then if we go to the patient, we need to be able to fit the prosthetic device immediately, because if we're traveling, the business model won't work if we have to keep coming back, right? So we want to be able to fit as we go. So they developed a new thermoplastic, which when you mold it, you put it on and it will mold, and then you can set it. They have this little jet. And remember, actually, I should have found the photograph. So they were part of the Enable Makeathon in 2016. And we did that with the ICRC between India and the UK. And Amparo were in Germany at the time. They came to the UK to take part in the Enable Makeathon. And I remember them hacking they had the polymer working, but they didn't have the kit. How would we then get it to work? And I remember we're sitting in this like makerspace, and it was a makeshift makerspace because GDI Hub space UCL was behind schedule in opening the building. So we had to ask friends in another building, would they let us use that building? And then we had to bring all the machines, like the 3D printers and everything, into this basically an office space and transform it into a makerspace over a weekend. And they were there hacking these solutions. And then by the time we'd set up GDI Hub and we opened up a call for ventures that we could support, they had got to the stage where they had CE marked, they knew what they were doing, and they wanted to see, could this work in Kenya? So we supported them coming to Kenya. And I put these slides in just to say that at this stage, Amparo had done all of this bit. The disability interactions bit they'd done. They had done applied and basic research. They'd gone off and they'd spoken to a lot of prosthetists and a lot of prosthetic users. They had then gone back, that's the applied research, they'd tried to understand the problem statement. They'd then gone back to the lab and they'd created the material science. They'd then gone back and tried that. People did like it. They'd then gone back and realized they needed to create the machine that would set the polymer. So then they were fine, and then they go back. And so they had done this really well, and they'd come up with a completely different interaction for people. So they had done all the hard work, in my opinion. But what they hadn't managed to do, and they'd got a very clear design problem, but as they began to develop it, they weren't sure it would work. And one of the biggest problems in somewhere like Kenya, especially in somewhere like Mombasa, it's a little bit climate-wise, a little bit like here, it's hot, but it's humid. So at the moment, we weren't sure if above 38 degrees, it could be that the socket might begin to melt again. And although you can test that in a lab, as we spoke about yesterday on day 3, the prosthetic limb gets very hot, doesn't it? It gets very hot and sticky. So although we can put in a lab, we can simulate external climate, we can't simulate that actual skin interface in that climate on people. So at some point, you have to do a human trial of this technology. And that was the bit where they were scared. Because as a small company, that's quite a big risk, especially for a lower limb prosthetic device. What happens if they begin to walk and somebody begins to fall? But if they come in through our program, then we're researching independently. I have no vested interest in Amparo succeeding or not succeeding. I just want to do the research. And at that point, UCL can sponsor the research ethically. So we can sponsor the ethics of the research. And at that point, we take the insurance risk of the trial. And so that makes their life an awful lot easier. Plus, we're able to develop a clinical trial because the guys that develop this are mechanical engineers. They're not clinical trial specialists. So they can then get access to help there. So all of these different types of evidence and support we helped at various stages, all of the ventures. So data, the setup phase, we look at data even with the company that we're working with, although we're going to collect data and we're then going to give them results. If they want any of the raw data, we will only transfer it if they have a very strict data management plan. So we need to know how they will manage their data, that data is secure. If it's clinical data storage, where will that be stored? And will that be in line with the country's government's regulations? Post-completion of the study, we have to look at data storage and curation. How long should we keep this data for, and how should it be gotten rid of? So we help them in thinking through planning the trial, planning the analysis, what kind of stats we might use, the trial protocol, the statistical analysis plan, and also how to cost it. Now, in this case, the trial was costed by 80-20-30 by the UK aid programme, but it cost a lot of money. So who wants to give a guess about how much it cost to run a clinical trial in 2 sites in Kenya of 20 patients in the end, over 6 months, including all the componentry for the prosthetic legs. So not just their socket, but all of the rest of the componentry. Yeah, exactly right, £100,000. So it cost £100,000 to do that one clinical trial. So you can see that that's not cheap. Now, we now have those protocols, and we've given those protocols to other ventures. So once the protocol's been completed, and it's been registered as a clinical trial, and the data's been published, it's been published in ISPO, Prosthetics and Orthotics journals. At that stage, people begin to get a bit of confidence in that protocol. So actually developing the protocol did cost a bit of money, because we had to go and visit the hospitals, we had to work with the clinicians, we had to see what would work in country, we had to see what would work for the patients. So there's a bit of work. So the next one wouldn't cost so much. And in future, you might, for example, the componentry, you might be able to get cheaper. But trying to get components at that stage into Kenya for one trial was really expensive. So yeah, so we helped with regulation. We also did a little bit of work on public involvement. So although the clinical study is published, we did a lot of studies where we talked to users about their experience. There was more of a qualitative piece. And we did that before we started. So there's a thing called public involvement or public patient involvement, PPI, where before you start a trial, you're allowed to collect data, but basically you're collecting quite qualitative data to try and understand what the study should be. So we did that. We ran the statistics for them and helped them with knowing how to do that themselves in the future. We looked at research governance systems, and then we also did training. So kept explaining to them, we did training for them, but they would need to, if they bring in new staff, train them. So what would be their training protocols? So this was the study. We had March to April was plan the study. May was get ethics. June was prepare for the study. July was phase 1. So that was training the Centre of Prosthetics and Orthotics in both sites, ensuring the mechanisms for data collections on patients are in place. So just making sure the data would be secure and making sure people knew what data to collect properly. Then in study phase 2 was fitting and follow-up. So it was meant to be 40 lower limb amputees, 20 in each site, and then closing interviews with the CPOs. So the clinical prosthetists and orthoticists. Now, what ended up happening was in the middle of this, COVID hit. So we only ended up with 20 patients in the end. So we had 40 at phase 1, and we even had about 38 at phase 2. But for the full study where we actually managed to track them, we only had about 20, I think, was the final study. So I'll put the papers from all of this into the. I've got some actually. So moving on. This is just an example of what happened. This was literally 2 minutes after Arnold's leg was fit. He was delighted. He was very happy with himself. Then he decided that we should go to where he lives, where he then showed us. I do actually have a video, but it's quite big. The only other thing to note is that you can still see that the foot component is white. Right? Now, obviously, you would prefer to have a brown foot component, but we couldn't get them in time. We just could not get them in. So we had to run with white feet components just for the time being. But most of the participants didn't mind so much because they put a shoe around it. So and the rest of the limb was like had no skin colouring. But Arnold was delighted. He started playing football. It all went very well. So yeah, we fitted 40 below the knee amputees with new prosthetic leg, but also we were training and trying to understand can the prosthetists use this new technology? Because sometimes you get this sort of bias in people's thinking that, I don't know why they think it, but well, the clinicians won't be able to do it. Why not? They're fully trained prosthetists that are clever, intelligent humans. Of course they're able to do it. But it's not just that they're able to do it, but then also, do they want to do it? Do they believe in the technology? Like, can we get feedback from them? So there was a lot of feedback. I won't go into a great lot more detail on that. There's some clinical papers. But what we really found from that, just as GDI Hub, because if you imagine we're starting to look after this venture, but also it was only our second year as GDI Hub. So we also learned a lot about what is it that ventures need, how do we best support ventures, what can we do? And then we took all of that knowledge from the Innovate Now. There was Innovate Now, there was Motivation and Humanity and Inclusion. We did 3 projects, and Amparo was a startup, a real startup. Motivation was a small NGO, which has a small charity, but was quite established. So it had a really established network everywhere. And Humanity and Inclusion, you might have heard of as a massive international non-government organization. So with the massive international non-government organization, Humanity and Inclusion, we were looking at innovating of 3D printed orthotic devices in refugee camps in Uganda. And effectively, I barely know what happened in that study. I mean, I've read the final reports, but they just didn't need any help. Does that make sense? They just knew exactly what they were doing. They just needed the £100,000. They knew how to get 3D printers into the country. They knew how to run research. They had ethics people. They have ethics processes. They have a full network. They really didn't need our help. Motivation needed our help. They had a network everywhere, but it was the research bit. They needed us to do the trial bit. They just didn't know how. They're innovators, or they invent wheelchairs, but they weren't sure of that pathway into practice. Whereas Amparo needed not only that, the practice of getting the trial put together and the protocols, but they didn't even have the network. So without us, they didn't know how to contact the hospitals. They weren't sure how to work with other people in the sector to get patients or to get people. Whereas, for example, if you were working here, on a mobility device, you just go to the R2D2 lab and you would have access to all the NGOs, you'd have access to all of that, and you already have access to all of the clinical trial training. So probably the only time somebody like Sujathna or the R2D2 lab might need any sort of help from someone like GDI Hub is if they wanted to go to a new place like Kenya. You might not know the partners in Kenya. And so really our only role would be help you find some partners, right? Because you've got all the rest of the clinical expertise. So it sort of helped us make a little grid internally so that we could funnel, because we were beginning to get lots of things. And so one thing we did was we packaged a lot of the knowledge up into how do we help the really early stage startups. And that we put into Innovate Now, which is Africa's first assistive technology accelerator. So it's powered by GDI Hub. It was delivered initially by AMREF, and it's currently being delivered by KBTA. We've got about 48, I think it's actually gone up to about 56 startups. We're on our 8th acceleration cycle, actually. And then we have a live labs network. So there's spaces where you can get rapid user development. So if you've got a device for visually impaired people, KBTA works with all the blind schools. So they'll bring you along. You'll be able to quickly talk to people, get some user feedback. Whereas if you need to do something in prosthetics, you can go to the Cure Hospital and they will be able to quickly give you some feedback. We've got this inclusive entrepreneur curriculum. So we give lectures each week for about 10 weeks. So it's a fixed curriculum. So we've run it on 6 weeks, 10 weeks, and 12 weeks. But there's lectures that are delivered by us at GDI Hub, or the content was developed by us. Now, because we've done it so often, it's often delivered by the Kenyan partners because they've heard it so many times. And then the Kenyan partners have integrated sort of local business analysis and local business case studies. And then we have that entrepreneur toolkit that I showed you before. So we had started doing that, and we ran, over COVID, we ran Innovate Now 3 times. And we had these great ventures coming out. And then, like I'm sure is the case with many of your inventions, you get to a certain point where you need money. It's fine for me to say, I can mentor you and I can support you and I can give you, but you have to eat, right? And you need, so either you have a full-time job over here, and then, in your evenings, that's what we did with GDI Hub. We all had full-time jobs, but over here we did the work. But that was okay because it was an idea about a centre rather than an actual product that you've got to get to market, which is much harder. So we then convinced UK Aid to give us some more money to test an assistive technology impact fund. So initially, Innovate Now was funded by UK Aid. It's currently funded by Norwegian Aid, NORAD. But it will be continued. It will always need grant income to fund it. It's never going to be something in the current climate that it could just be self-sustaining. The Assistive Technology Impact Fund, we put an open call out. Anybody could apply, and there was a lot of people applying. but we ended up with 5. I mean, we tried to get a mix because we were testing different things. So Koala is an upper limb prosthetic company. Wazi is a glasses company. HearX is a hearing solutions company. Miracle Feet fixes club feet. So if you get club foot where your legs are externally rotated as a child, sometimes people don't get those corrected. And there's a very simple method called the Ponseti method that can correct it, but people don't use it, and then people aren't able to walk, even though it could be corrected if you just walk. It's like wearing braces on your teeth. You've got to wear braces on your feet for about the first year or 2, and then you're fine, but it's getting people to actually do it is the problem. And OAD-CPH is a distribution company in West Africa. So they just distribute assistive technologies. So they were very different and interesting case studies, and I don't really have time to go through each of them because they're very different. So I thought I'd pick on HearX and just try and show you some of the initial stuff we did with them on trying to identify customers, on trying to think about where they were going to go. So so we did that using this thing that we call the GDI Accelerate Innovation Canvas. So I think I've got one that comes up bit by bit. Yeah, so for example here, just for a second, here you'll see everything should start from user needs, right? We should have some idea of a need that we're trying to fix. So even in your nanotech hearing example, you initially want to improve hearing. You've looked at hearing aids and you've gone, people would like better hearing, right? So you're here. Now you would come down here. You're sort of an emerging technology. That's what you're doing. And that brings a specific flavor to the innovation canvas when you've got an emerging technology, partly because the emerging technology will cost a lot of money to develop. It will also maybe need greater regulations. The regulations might not even have caught up with the technology sometimes. So it has its own path, and I'm not going to go into that today because it's one of the hardest ones to go into and go through. The one I'm going to focus on is the service gap. And the reason I'm going to focus on the service gap is because really yesterday we heard a great story about the standing wheelchair as well as the Neobolt. And that's really about thinking about a failure of an existing product. Would you agree? Yeah. So the existing product doesn't stand, or you can't get a standing product here. So we look at that. So for that, you start to think, okay, so who's it for? We've got some initial user needs, but now you've got to start to think about these users and shift your mindset slightly from users to customers. And so you're thinking about, okay, what does the user really need, but also maybe what do the decision makers need in their ecosystem. You're also thinking about, this is like your activities, you might start to do, so when what is it that people are going to, where is it going to fit in people's lives, right? So you might do a customer journey, like this is how people currently get a wheelchair, okay. We might start to do some prototyping. So these are all the what activities that people do whilst they're trying to figure out and adapt their user. So we know an initial user, we've got a rough idea, but we're not yet able to put them into sort of personas, and we're trying to get to that persona bit. And before we can get to personas, we have to do a little bit of prototyping, because then we have to test it with people, and we're constantly evaluating who our users are as we do that. As we do more of the customer map, we'll evaluate, see back and forward. So here, for example, you want to get a prosthetic leg. I keep forgetting I can just look at this. So you've got these different phases. You want to arrange an appointment, and then you have to wait, and that normally takes 2 weeks. This is in the UK. This is one that we developed for the UK. Then you need pre-appointment preparation. So you need to figure out how you're going to get to the appointment. Then you have an appointment. That's normally half a day. Then you've got some waiting to do. That's normally 2 weeks. Then you need to go back for appointment number 2. That's normally a full day. Then you've got a week of waiting. Then you've got appointment number 3. And then you've got the point of getting used to the new leg. Yeah.
So it's not their daily life.
No. It's how do they get the device. So like literally how do they get the device? And what we try to do when we're doing a journey map is map the activities. So Tom calls the prosthetic centre to arrange an appointment. Yeah. And what's he thinking? I wonder how long I'm going to have to wait. Is this urgent, or is it just a bit annoying? No, I need it sorting now. He's beginning, like, this is what he's thinking. So we try to think about what are they doing, what are they thinking, then what's their overall experience. And normally the overall experience of spending half a day in a clinic and waiting a week is like the worst point. So you generate these from talking to people. You keep speaking to people and seeing until you've built up the whole map. And normally when you're in a particular bit of your project, you probably know a bit of this, and all you're doing is sense checking it. But then there'll be bits of it you haven't figured out. And then sometimes you might end up with 2 journey maps of delivery. Like one is, like just in England, for example, you might have a different one. North of England might be much quicker at doing this than the south of England because there's higher demand.
Government versus private would be
Yeah,
very, very
exactly. So you have these different. You have these different. So I'm sure that when Sujatha, I'm going to pretend that I know this is true, but I'm sure that Sujatha was talking to more and more users and trying to understand things like who gives the wheelchairs, what happens. And all of that time, you're probably mapping out how do people get wheelchairs. You're doing more prototypes, and you're also beginning to pitch the idea. You're beginning to sort of, that pitching deck, you sort of start early, like you end up having a PowerPoint or whatever deck system you use to go along and show people the case, and it keeps getting updated. And after a little while, you end up at this point, you've got a value proposition. You really understand, and you might do a SWOT analysis. Here's our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. You might do that, but you should definitely have a very clear problem statement. So you really know exactly this is our device solves this problem for these users, and it works in this way. You really know what you're doing. And whilst you're doing what your activities are, you also probably want to map who your existing partners are and who your partners that you want are, along with resources. So resources can be a loan. It can be a working capital loan because this keeps being updated, right? Like we can do this for GDI Hub. It keeps being updated. Each time you progress it gets updated. But it might just be that you need, I don't know, Otterbock, will they give you some components, for example? Could they be a partner? Would they give you some components? Other resources might be that you really need a clinician in your team, but you've got no money, and you're wondering if there's a clinician that might want to join the project team early on. It might even be as simple as a web developer. You need somebody to do the website, like or social media. I mean, I'm terrible at social media, but we've got somebody in GDI Hub who does social media. I mean, that's their job. They do our social media, and they do a very good job of it, and I don't have to worry about it, right? So it's those kind of resources you begin to map in. And then you get to phase 3, which is kind of like, okay, we've got this clear problem statement. At this stage, you've probably got a very good working prototype, and you've got a really good deck. So you can go into any of these pitching, Dragon Den pitches, and you're able to do your 10-minute or 5-minute pitch and say, this is what we need. But the minute you ask for money, somebody's going to say, okay, so what are you going to do? Like what? Okay, so I want to give you £100,000. Great, what are you going to do? And so for that, you really need to think about how you're going to develop your business plan. And that's this part. That's this part here. So you need to think about your business planning. So thinking about here, I keep going over to the screen, but here for the users, this might be willingness to pay. Alongside who is the customer. Because it might be that the decision maker is the customer and it's not the user, okay? Or it might be that you can bypass the decision maker to the user if you develop a pay-as-you-go model, for example.
I didn't understand this question. The decision maker.
So the decision maker would be something like, say if you go to a clinician for a wheelchair and the hospital you go to only stocks 3 types of wheelchairs. But the wheelchair you want is wheelchair number 4. You can't get it because the decision makers of the hospital only have 3 different wheelchairs. And also, you tend to, the other point might be if you develop for children, it's going to be the parents who decide, for example. Yeah, exactly. Who's making the decisions about whether or not you can actually have that? And sometimes the user is the purchaser directly. Sometimes there's an intermediary, and sometimes it's a really strong intermediary, if that makes sense. Like it's like I mean, if you don't, for example, if you don't have FDA approval, you're not selling in the United States, there's a real big barrier to you ever. You've got no customers in the United States because they can't get your device because you haven't got the regulatory approval. So, and that's where these kind of activities come in. So here you might be thinking, I need regulation. Because the market we want to enter is like the example of the haptic vest. They've decided it can't yet enter the Kenyan market, it needs to enter the UK, so it will need a CE mark, right? And so they might begin to think, okay, so some of our activities as we're doing these prototypes need to be in line with what's going to be needed for CE marking. So you're coming down here, and eventually you end up with a suggested plan. So this is both your business plan So you have a business plan at the end, and you'd be able to then show in your pitch deck. In some ways, this would go back up to your pitch deck if you wanted to. You'd show in your pitch deck, look, here's the user need. You'd start up here. We had this initial user need. We're building a failure. There's a failure in the product gap. There's no product user fit for what we're developing. We've spoken to 100 users. We know now that this is the exact user we're looking for, and we've been prototyping. And while we've been prototyping, we know that we're on track to get the CE marking. Like, we've done the initial test for components. We've done this test. We know we're getting somewhere. But what we need now is to do a full clinical trial. That needs £100,000. If we get the full clinical trial, that would be the documentation we would need to finish, and we'd also need some other mechanical tests, say. We would then use some of the money for the trial, some of the money for CE marking, and then we think we'd be ready to go to market. So even at that point, the investor might say to you, okay, that's okay, sounds good, but then what's your go-to-market strategy? Oh, just go put it on a website. Hope people know it's there. I don't know. So, for example, if you think about the work of that's happening in getting the haptic vest into market, they're going to do a limited release of 100 units. They're going to build 100 units. They're going to do a limited release to what are called early adopters. So early adopters will want the technology. They're the people who love testing new tech. They're going to do that in 2 markets, so 50 in Austria and 50 in the UK. They're going to spend 6 months getting feedback, both on whether, if there's any bits of product failure, if there's any bit of user fit that doesn't work, if there's anything that needs to be improved. And then they're going to have 9 months before they develop the final product that's going to roll out. Now, the next question would be, well, can you manufacture at that scale? And then you'd be like, okay, I've got this manufacturer lined up. Here's the letter of intent, if you need to see it, that if we had this money, they would be able to do, because there are manufacturing places like Phoenix Medical where they're able to just swap what medical, they can just swap out and run a production line for a number of units. So you can buy space in a manufacturing unit that's not yours. You don't own it, you don't own the staff, but you trust them to deliver it. Then my next question would be, well, have you seen them make one and does it work at the end, right? Because that has been a massive problem with a couple of manufacturers in Kenya. Like, literally, give them a wheelchair, gets to the end, the 4 wheels don't touch the ground, the tolerances were so bad. So if the 4 wheels aren't touching the ground, I really don't want to put £100,000 into making, many. And I know companies that worked for a very long time trying to get 4 wheels to hit the ground, and it didn't work, right? There's been a similar problem in India, which I won't go into, you get to that point where each point you need to have the answer to the next question. So it can feel, it's why you end up in that valley of death, because you feel like it's very hard to feel like you're coming up the other end, because until you get to the point pretty much where Neobolt are now, where they're getting sales in of 100 units, they can see they're able to ship 100 units. At that point, I'm sure they're beginning to feel they're probably just breaking even at profitability. I think you said yesterday they are. So just beginning to make a little bit of a profit. Banks are beginning to loan to them, standard banks. So they're out of this valley of death, but it's taken a lot of that work to get there. So I thought I'd just have a think about the service gap problem. So the HearX problem that I mentioned yesterday was very much a service gap. And I can't go through everything that we did with HearX because some of it is confidential and it's part of their unique business plan, but I can give you an idea of how we began to look at going from users to customers, and also a little bit about how we then thought about these additional partners. So I'm really going to focus on this bit and this bit because that's the bits I can focus on. So just to give an overview, the product is an innovative diagnostic model for hearing aids, so lay health workers can detect, diagnose, and demonstrate in one sitting. The purpose is that 466 million people globally have hearing impairments, but high cost and a lack of qualified health professionals mean that less than 3% can access hearing aids. In Africa, there is less than 1 hearing professional for every 1 million people, but HearX uses digital technologies to connect hearing aids to a Bluetooth app, enabling in-ear testing to connect to an online hearing expert who can remotely fine-tune. Now, HearX haven't done everything. The hearing aid that they use already connects wirelessly or via Bluetooth to an app. All they're doing is integrating that into a novel service delivery. And their innovation is actually in the screening. So they're able to screen. They've then managed to integrate that into a proprietary application. So there's an app, Lexicon Hearing Aids. They have their own app. They've combined their screening tool with that tool. And then they've developed a business model so that they can train healthcare workers to use it. So in terms of 80-20-30, the impact we had was we created and tested a new business model and a new finance model, partnering with health tech infrastructure to reach new markets, using this app-based onboarding on WhatsApp for maximised engagement. And in the future, HearX are looking to scale the solution, creating healthy hearing for everyone, everywhere. So they had a business model. They came to us with a business model. This, honestly, HearX, they published all their own papers out of this. The guy who runs it is an audiologist in WITS. He's a professor there. He's an academic. He's great. The only thing they needed help with was what could we do in Kenya? Because they're a South African company and they wanted to enter the Kenyan market. And so it was more around how would we distribute? How could people afford to pay for these devices there? They knew they had a business model that worked. And obviously South Africa to Kenya, the actual people, it's not going to be that different, but the infrastructure around it would be different. So in terms of this service gap, we went from users to customers. So the first thing is we looked at two ways of distributing. Well, these are just two of the ways we looked at. We looked at many ways, but I'll just present two. Azuri are people who do solar panels, pay-as-you-go solar panels. Now you might think, why are you going to Azuri? Well, because Azuri have got everywhere. They've got to really rural locations. They are selling solar panel electricity to people in Kenya with a pay-as-you-go model everywhere, right? So we thought, well, can they do hearing aids? We don't know. But we thought, first of all, we need to know what their customers like. Who would we be selling to? So what we found out was somebody, this is like a persona type thing. Anne lives in Fanula, Busia County. She's 58, has been married for 39 years. She has 4 adult children, 7 grandchildren. She only completed some primary school education and earns income working on a farm and cleaning in a local shop. Money's extremely tight for Anne and her husband. She often struggles to hear what her grandchildren are saying when she looks after them. She doesn't have a hearing aid, nor does anyone she knows. She's not even especially sure what they are. The only time she went to see a doctor about her hearing, it turned out to be an issue with wax. She isn't especially concerned about the difficulty in getting a hearing test, although she's never really thought about it. But it's always cautious of anything that could add to her household expenses. If we ask Anne how much, this is one of the things you can do, is ask somebody how much do you think this product would cost, and they give you an idea. So if you ask Anne how much a hearing aid would likely cost, she'd estimate that it would approximately cost 6,000 Kenyan shillings, so about $55. Then when you tell her, if you had to pay for a hearing aid at 20,000 Kenyan shillings, which is $180, what could she do? And she says, well, she would need to pay monthly. She would need to pay monthly, but she might be willing to pay a deposit. There's no way she could pay for that upfront. So when it comes to hearing aids, she doesn't really have a color preference, but if you forced her to pick one, she'd want a black or silver one. She only has a basic phone and occasionally receives calls and text messages on it. So the WhatsApp model is not going to work very well unless you also provide a phone. Whereas Ilara Health are pharmacies that are everywhere, but mostly in cities. They're like a private pharmacy chain. And so the typical customer there would be Vincent. So Vincent lives on the outskirts of Nairobi. He's just turned 62, been married for 35 years, 2 adult children. He's completed secondary school and has been self-employed for 30 years selling clothes at the Kikomba market. He doesn't have a pension. He has some health issues, meaning he goes to pharmacies a few times per year, but generally he is well. He doesn't have a hearing aid, nor does anyone he knows. However, recently he's finding it harder and harder to hear what customers are asking him. He thinks that it would be difficult to get a hearing test, even though he's never had one and doesn't live with anyone who's had one. If he decides to get his possible hearing issue examined, he'll go to a hospital as a first point of call. If we asked Vincent how much a hearing aid would likely cost, he'd estimate that it would approximately cost $135 or 15,000 Kenyan shillings. And if he had to pay for a hearing aid at 20,000 Kenyan shillings, approximately $180, he would need to pay monthly but might be willing to pay a deposit. When it comes to hearing aids, he also doesn't really have a color preference, but if you forced him to pick, he would pick black or silver. He has only a basic phone and occasionally receives text calls and text messages on it. He could end up with a smartphone someday, but don't count on it. So they might look similar, those customers. There's a lot of similarities in those customers, but the Azuri customers are mostly rural. The Elara customers are mostly urban. Azuri, generally low levels of education, primary schooling, whereas the Elara customers have a little bit more education, so generally moderate levels of education. Presumably, that would then translate to being slightly better able to develop digital literacy if you gave them a smartphone. Often farmers earning a daily wage in the rural community, whereas people are self-employed but still earning a daily wage in the Elara customers. Both are unaware of hearing aids, their benefits and their costs. But the Elara customers had a better estimation. They were better able to guess the price that you might have to pay. Most have only used basic phones, mostly to receive calls. Occasionally they receive and send text, whereas the Elara customers, approximately 3 in 4 have used text messages as well as receiving calls. So given all of that, what we ended up going through this, if you look here at the possible partner bit, the Azuri thing seemed great, but it seemed like, so there's another part of this whole deck that's a bit confidential, but it sort of goes through all of the, what does that mean for the business model? How does that affect things? And the thought of people, the price point being so wildly off what they thought, the fact that nobody's going to have a smartphone probably in the area, and so you're going to be teaching quite a lot, and the fact that you're going to have, a poorer population, whereas going into the cities first seemed like that could be a good idea. But we did go and have a look at the partners, and for example, the Azuri agents, we worked with the Azuri agents, and this again is like a persona of what came out from that. So for the first bits of work, we randomly sampled customers. We just asked pharmacists if they'd tell people about this idea, and we got people, and the same through the Azuri agents, would they just get people? And so we ended up with sort of a 10-page report and there was 4 markets that we looked at, 4 different ways, and these were the most promising 2 that we then went a bit further with. So Ronald's been working for Azuri for the last 2 years. He enjoys working for them, and it helps support his self-employment income so that he can support his wife and 4 children. Feels lucky that he was provided with a smartphone by Azuri. Not everyone gets to have one. Using this in his motorbike, he can quickly get around door-to-door selling. For each sale he makes, he receives a one-off payment for the next day. If the customer continues paying, he gets a monthly income from that customer. He really wants to become a platinum member of the Azuri team, so he gets paid more, but he's not sure exactly how much more he would get for that. He's also not sure exactly on the percentages he gets per product. If we ask Ronald if he would like to start selling Herex products, he would generally be happy to. As someone who sees different communities, he thinks it's something people need. He particularly likes that it makes Azuri look like they are caring for their community. However, he would stress cost as a concern. For him to begin selling our product, he'd want to test it out for himself, have some training on how to use the product, and a full run through of how the installment plan will work. And if people have problems paying, he has no issue reclaiming the product. However, he'd try to change people to daily payments so that people can catch up. He'd also offer overpayment options for when times were good. Whereas in the Elara facilities, the type of people, the intermediaries you'd be working with, where Peter owns a small clinic with 2 staff who assist him. He undertook technical training and opened his clinic so that he can help his community. His clinic typically serves 10 people per day and has a good relationship with his regulars, who make up 60% of his customers. To manage the clinic, he started to embrace technology, but generally sticks to using WhatsApp. He doesn't use formal stock inventory system and doesn't have business insurance because margins are tight. Generally, he's open to stocking new products, but needs to see there's customers' demand first. He typically expects product providers to provide training on any relevant equipment. If we ask Peter to start stocking Herex products, generally he thinks it's something the community needs. However, he's skeptical that his customers will be able to afford it. It's also not a product or service that people frequently ask for. However, a handful of people per month do, which he refers to specialists. To stock our product, he would need some evidence of demand in his area, a clear price point that he thinks is affordable, and a product demo to demonstrate quality. He'd then want someone to train his staff how to use the product. He doesn't really plan marketing, but will sometimes message customers if he thinks they could benefit from a new product. So you can see that all of those insights would go back into you really helping to develop your problem statement. And you know, HereX is still on a development journey, but you in your groups might have a very different feeling. Like you might have, I don't know, like you depending on your appetite for risk, for example, you might go one way or you might go another way. You might just naturally, you might be a clinician, you might be naturally inclined to the clinical side. The other thought might be actually you're a bit more entrepreneurial in spirit, you might be more inclined to the entrepreneurial spirit. So there's some psychology that comes into this, but we do these kinds of, I would call them very light touch research. There's normally anything from 10 to 100 people at a time. And then we try to get rapid insights for the venture to then, but it's not our job to make their business plan. It's their job to make the business plan. All we're doing is providing insights at a useful time so that they can then decide whether they want to go with somebody who's a bit more tech savvy or somebody who's not. They can make that decision. And they will run it through different SWOT analysis. So they'll go with one, they'll do a SWOT analysis, then they'll look at some of the weaknesses, they'll see if they can counter those weaknesses, then they'll go back, they'll reassess, then they'll go over to the other board, they'll try another business model, and you sort of run through the 4 different scenarios 2 or 3 times. You might spend a whole half day doing it, and then you pick one, and we decide on the next 6 weeks. So we do everything in 6-week sprints, so then we decide on the next 6 weeks. So, okay, you pick one, let's say we pick the Lara one, doesn't matter what, okay. Right, so what did Lara say they wanted? We'd go back to what did Lara say he wanted right at the very end. He said he would need some evidence of demand in his area, a clear price point he thinks is affordable, and a product demo. So the demo should be easy enough. That should be fine. But demand, we might need to suddenly start really looking at how do we understand demand in that area, as well as begin to do more detailed work on price points. So you might hire a local person or local team or local marketing company to go out even just into markets. You might set up a stall. We did this before for one other company. We did a pop-up for Wazi, where we did a pop-up in a mall just to see if we have this pop-up thing, how many visitors do we get in a week? Because that will begin to help us understand that demand better, because nothing tells you better than just doing something. So you can sort of test those, and then that's your question. So our job then as a research team that's supporting that venture is to figure out something that can be delivered within 6 weeks to give them back. And at the same time, they might go away and think more about the product side. Like how will they do this product demo remotely? What would work well? Do they want to start hiring people in country to have a country rep that could go and do these? And they would start running all of the business numbers on that. And they would be running business model numbers on various different price points, whilst we're going out and finding out what people would be willing to pay, so that when you come back at the end of the 6 weeks, you're comparing that data again, and then you come on to the next problem statement. Does that make sense? Yeah. So sorry. Yeah. So that was the map we looked at before. So I lent here because then I thought we could maybe try and use the business canvas a little bit, like for one of the projects. You could just pick a project, and we can maybe have a think about how we would use it after the break. But one thing that you can look at, which I'll show you today, is across all of the ventures, we put together a playbook of all of the different learnings that we found. I can't seem to get this. But the AT, I'll just wait for it to finish doing whatever it's doing, but the AT Impact Fund playbook means that you can look at what are called plays. It's very innovation speak. I don't particularly like the word, but anyway, I was outvoted by all of the younger people in the team. But these plays are meant to be, if I'm a venture, what's like the deal I can go, this play deal thing. I don't really understand it. But anyway, as far as I'm concerned, a play is just like a set of activities, like a thing that you can do. So you can look at venture plays, venture profiles, but also fund plays. So the idea of the fund play being that you could look, if you want to set up your own fund, these are things, basically they're like lessons learnt, like things that we learnt as we went along that are just made into a public good. I can't seem to show it to you right now. But that was basically the playbook. You can see here, for example, how to structure investments for the first time through a new mechanism in order to maximize impact. So what did we do? What were the lessons learned? So for example, one thing we learned down here was short-term payment milestones agreed with the grantees. So the grantees were getting quite a lot of money, anything from $100 to $200 or $250,000 was being invested. But we just basically made it so that there was regular short payments. So every 6 to 12 weeks, we would issue another tranche of payments so that their working capital didn't have to go too far, but also our risk was mitigated because we only had a small amount of money to give out, and we didn't want to give out $200,000 and then see nothing happen, because all of these ventures have different priorities as well, right? They've all got day jobs or they've all got other things going on. So with the best will in the world, people will say they're going to do something, but then something else will come up. So we wanted to just say, well, if they have to pause, they pause, but then we're not releasing the money for the next bit until you're ready to start again. So we tried to be flexible and fair, but I can show you that afterwards. So the other thing that we did was it wasn't all of the ATIF ventures, but across some of them, and then some additional ones, we developed this idea of a formal way of understanding impact, and that has just been published in a report. So I can go through the slides. I don't know, should I go, keep going? And, yeah. So the idea was to create a core survey model that could be used in measuring the ATIF portfolio company impact performance vis-a-vis disability issues. So trying to understand how much it would improve hearing, for example, how much it would then improve quality of life, and how much it might improve education, whilst at the same time gathering useful user insights for product and service improvement. So it had to go two ways, because you're asking a venture to spend quite a lot of time in delivering their overall impact, but they also need to know something about what's going to help them go forward. The survey was both qualitative and quantitative questions, should be easy to administer and respond to, be completed in 15 to 20 minutes. So I don't know, how many surveys have you taken? I wouldn't, after 15 minutes, I'd begin to get a bit like, I don't want, people normally within assistive technology are a bit more generous with their time because they really want to improve the product, but 15 to 20 minutes was the max. The core module will be accompanied by a number of focused additional modules covering certain themes. These may be implemented independently or added to the core module in order to dig a little deeper into specific themes. So that would extend to 20 to 30 minutes if you did use them. So we created the modules to allow for us to map the AT innovation ecosystem by producing a robust foundational data set which evidenced the impact created by startups and companies in the disability space. So afterwards, the modules will be utilised with all the ATIF portfolio companies, but the intention is that they can also be used by all innovation projects at GDI Hub and by people beyond ATIF, 80, 20, 30 and GDI Hub. So we partnered with somebody called 60 decibels, yeah, that's it. And 60 decibels already have a really robust mechanism for doing what's called development impact. So if I don't know, UK Aid or US Aid or somebody Aid or UNICEF or somebody decides to implement a girls and coding program, for example, right? They implement that. 60 decibels have a telephone-based survey system which they use that they can very quickly say how impactful that was, right? But they weren't ever collecting data on disabled people. They didn't have any disaggregated data on how many users of any of these impact surveys they'd done were disability-based. But what they did have was quite a good, robust way of collecting this data. They could quickly phone people, get these answers, come back. So we founded with them. We said the IP would be shared. They could continue to use it in anything they wanted to do. So they can now sell their services to ventures if they so wish. But equally, GDI Hub would make it an open source set of tools that anybody could use, and we would still be allowed to use it internally. So in terms of putting it together, February 21, we started co-developing the disability modules with the GDI Hub experts and 60 decibels. We finalised those in May. Then we tested it with Miracle Feet, which was our first venture. So we did one venture test. We collected data in Nigeria and Liberia and we did the analysis and module iterations as required. We then released the Miracle Feet impact report, and then afterwards we started doing other companies. So like any good innovators, we tested it with one first and we made some improvements. It was interesting when we did it with Miracle Feet at the beginning. They did it because I think they did it because they felt it was part of what they were meant to do to get the money for ATIF. Does that make sense? And they sort of went along with it. But then afterwards, when we showed them their report, they were like, oh my God, that's really interesting. There's some really interesting insights in there. We'd never have got those. We thought we knew everything. We didn't know it. So it did work out quite well. Here are the people who developed it. And so in terms of, these are the modules that we ended up creating. 80 core impact performance survey, disability determination and onset, so understanding when the disability happened, access to assistive tech, affordability of the assistive tech, use of other assistive tech products, usage of the one product. That's okay. Yeah, sure. No problem. Usage of the assistive tech product, perceived usefulness of the assistive tech, impact and activities on the daily living and well-being, impact on work, impact on social ties and relationships, and self-determination. We have questions for all of these. So as an example, the core impact survey. So it might not look particularly nice, but that's partly because it's implemented then, it was then implemented on the 60 decibel system. So they're just ringing, and these questions just sort of get fed into a system that they have. So this was the format they needed, so that's why it looks like that. Like we would ask people approximately how months ago did you first start using what product? Did you own something beforehand? Could you easily find a good alternative to this company? And that question was actually a really interesting one for the company that they'd never, for some reason, people never thought of asking. They didn't realise that if there was a good competitor nearby, they might have to change their strategy for things. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that you would recommend the company to a friend? That's the standard net recommender score that nearly every company asks you at the end of like something. Have you experienced any challenges with the product or company? Can you explain any challenges you have faced? Has it been resolved? How do you feel about the overall statement? How do you feel about the statement overall? Here X made it easy for me to handle my issue. Do you strongly agree, somewhat agree? What about here X could be improved? Has your quality of life changed because of it? And then that's it. So that should take no more than 10 to 15 minutes, and that would give us the basics, right? We would know, is it solving the person's problem? Is there a competitor out there that they could easily switch to? And what impact is it having on their quality of life? And those things can be fed into sort of models of whether or not of retention of customers. So if it's not hitting your needs, if you've run into a couple of challenges and there's a local competitor, you're not going to retain that customer for very long. Whereas if there's nobody near, they don't know of any competitor, they've had a couple of challenges but you fixed them, you're probably very safe, you know? So we could begin to give the customers that. If they wanted to, we then had what are called the Washington Group questions. So these questions were produced in Washington by the Washington Group. And they are the standard set of questions that you can ask on any survey to basically try to understand what level of functioning people have. So whether people have difficulty seeing, whether people have difficulty hearing. These questions form the basis for the WHO RATA, the rapid assessment. So if I ask you, do you have, so here, for example, do you have difficulty seeing? You might say no, right? Then I could ask you, without your assistive technology, do you have difficulty seeing? And you would say yes, right? But I could say at the moment, I still have difficulty seeing. If I was doing the RATA right now, I would say I still have difficulty seeing, and actually I get a headache pretty much every day because I really do need a new prescription. I haven't had time to get one. But I'm still, so I would be an undermet need, right? I still haven't managed to have my needs fulfilled. Whereas most people, when you're asking the survey, it might not fulfill all of their needs. They might still have some hearing problems. But also you might begin to see that people that you're targeting, for example, that have hearing problems, they often also have mobility problems. And then you might begin to think about, oh, well, maybe we could also distribute mobility products, you know, or you might begin to see there's ways in which you can advance your product service. So yeah, we go right the way through. So difficulty hearing, seeing, walking, difficulty remembering, difficulty with self-care. Do you have using your usual language? Do you have difficulty communicating? Which of these do you think is the most, do you have most difficulty with? So trying to understand where the people's biggest barriers are. Would you mind sharing your age? So we only ever ask for age right at the very, very end because people normally don't like sharing their age. Well, some cultures in particular, and some people don't even know their age. So if you're me, for example. How old were you at the onset of the difficulty that you've had it? So that helps us understand how long they've been going. What's your highest level of education? There's some poverty probability index questions, which are a standard set of questions, which are not here, but they can be plugged in, which just give you an idea of whether or not where people are on the socio-economic scale. And at the beginning of the call, I said I would keep your name and details private. So please, just let you know that it's going to be kept private, and then you end, right? So we did this. So some of these, as you see, are disability determination and onset. Some of them are about access to assistive technologies. When did you first hear about a product and from whom? Affordability of assistive tech. We've got a set of modules on how did you finance the product. So did you fully self-finance? How did you get it? Non-profit, borrowed from a family member. How would you rate the value for money of your product? Thinking about the product, did you find the cost of subsequent borrowing repayment a heavy burden? So trying to understand that. And do you have to reduce your household's food consumption to purchase or make repayments for this product? That question really sadly at the moment, if you were to ask a lot of people living in the UK, would be yes. So a lot of people, so at the moment in the UK we've got a lot of poverty happening, and so a lot of nurses, for example, are having to use food banks to get free food because they can't afford food because the cost of food has gone up way higher than the cost of living. So sometimes, you know, you might think, sometimes I think people think, oh, the UK is very advanced or something, it's a very healthy, wealthy country. But actually, if you were to go to the poverty index at the moment, there are populations within the UK that are really struggling. So we have training now for our teachers on how to sort of help students. So my godson, he went to school, it's quite funny really, but he went to school recently. He came and start of term, he's 9. And he said, and the teacher said at the beginning now, you know, like if you forget to have breakfast or if you didn't have breakfast for any reason, just let one of the teachers know and we'll just make sure that you get some breakfast, right? And then somebody asked, well, why would you forget to have breakfast, right? So they said, well, some people can't afford breakfast, so we want to make sure that everybody has food. So it doesn't matter, there's no stigma, it doesn't matter, people forget sometimes you can't afford it, sometimes family circumstances change, just let one of us know and we'll make sure you get food. He comes home and he says to his mum, Mum, are we struggling because I have porridge every morning for breakfast? And she was like, no, that's not struggling. You went on 3 holidays this summer. People who go skiing are not struggling. So, but he was like, but it's funny, like, but you might not realize when you're entering a new population or a new country, you might have some assumptions, right? So people might assume, if they come from the UK, they could assume that people in Kenya are universally poor. That's not the case. You might assume that people in the UK are universally rich. That's not the case. So you really do need to really understand all of your users, because there will be rich and poor in any country, and of course it's relative, right? So use of other assistive tech products, find out what else they use. Overall, how important is that assistive tech product to you? Much more important somewhat. So trying to get a comparison of your product versus the other assistive tech they use. The usage, are you able to use your product whenever you need to? Could you explain why you're not able to use it? How easy or difficult do you find using it independently? So beginning to see if there's any user stuff we need to finish. Perceived usefulness, are you able to use your product whenever you need to? Could you explain why you're not able to if you can't? And how easy or difficult do you find using it? And so then we get into daily well-being. So then we start to look at, has your ability to see words very much improved? Has your ability, but you don't need to ask all of these, right? Because if you're a hearing product, then you're going to just do possibly the hearing one. And if they've said they also use glasses, you might ask them about glasses as well. So we have questions set up for everything to see what the changes for the well-being. If they work, we also ask about the quality of work, prospects. Has anything changed? Like, do they feel like they've got better prospects for work? Do they feel like they can work longer? Has it become easier to do tasks as you can see things better? We've also looked at the impact on social ties and relationships. So has your ability to get along with other people and making or keeping friendships changed? Has your ability to participate in social events changed? So there's lots of questions like that, so we get a full picture. And then the final one is self-determination, which sometimes is left out of some things. So some people feel that they have completely free choice and control over their lives, while other people feel that that what they do has no real effect on what happens to them. Imagine a 10-step ladder where the first step, the people stand there completely free of choice and control of the way they turn out. And on the highest step, the 10th step stands for those with the freest choice. So you've got free choice versus no choice. Where on the ladder do you think you are? On the step you are today, on which step are you today in relation to control over your work? So then we just go, that's overall. Then into your work, into your relationship, your social care, where you live, and maybe your family life. So we try to break that down. And then, so the 60 decibels, people have gone ahead and taken all of this work and they've built it into their business model. So they did the work with us very cheaply. We had no money, basically. But we needed to do an impact case study. It might have been $5,000, or like we really, the impact fund was running out of money, and so the business offer to them was, you're going to get all this disability expertise, and we're happy for you to start to include it, because from our point of view, if they're doing this type of work on anything, we'd like to see disabled people better represented in that, so that's good. And at the same time, we don't give you exclusivity over it because we want to make sure that people who can't afford you, we do really recommend people use them. They're excellent, they're really high quality, but they're expensive because they're doing phone surveys of 100 to 1,000 people, and that's just expensive. So we also wanted to say, well, we will put together these how-to guides so that people could use them as they, you could do it yourself with customers, even if it isn't perfect, if it isn't as perfect as the successful one. So, I think that it should have a break anyway, but when we come back, I just want to show you, I'll get up the slide deck and the report just to show you. And then I thought as an activity, we could just maybe think about completing some of this or brainstorming some of this together as a class for an emerging technology, just thinking about what we might do, because a lot of you work in that emerging tech space, so we could just sort of think about, and we could do that in small groups, or you could do it, or we can do it as one big class. I don't mind. But I think the break time's here, as in tea and things is here. So I'll just get these links to work while you're having a cup of tea, and then should we come back at I think we were having a bit of a longer break, so we're going to do the certificates. I'll check with Sujatha, I'll text her. But if you come back into the room for 1:45, then we might still take an extra 15 minutes, but I'll just double check. But if you sort of, because it might be that she wants to do the certificates from 1:45 to 12, and then we could just have an hour or half an hour just looking at this business canvas together. But as the next part might not be recorded, I'll put my final slide up, which is just to say thank you. So just in case you want to keep in contact with me, I'm happy to also give you my WhatsApp number if you want it. We could make a WhatsApp group. I don't, if somebody wants to be, if somebody wants to take control of doing that, then feel free. Anybody who knows me well enough knows that I'm not very good on email. I receive a lot of emails. And oftentimes I'm on trips like this, so then I return home to, 1,000 emails, and I've got to get through 1,000 emails on a plane. And if I don't know your name, like it can, if you do email me, a good idea would be, for example, to put the Gian course follow-up or something, and then because I'm skimming hundreds. So if I see that, whereas if it's something vague, I just miss it, and then you feel like I've ignored you. So if I have ignored you, you can email me again. I don't mind, right? And I hope that you don't think I'm being rude. I don't get offended if you chase me. If you start chasing me every day, I might get annoyed. But if it's like after a week you email me, and then a week you email me, and then I will answer. Okay, so. But it's been great being here with you guys. I hope it's been useful to you, and we'll still do the business thing, but I think they won't record it. So, all right. I just didn't want to put my WhatsApp number on this because it was being recorded.